I'm actually down in Devon. That's where I live, in England. And so I've come a long way for you, you lot this morning. But one thing that, as great as Devon is, it's lovely, it's beautiful, but one thing that the churches there don't have are Welsh singing voices. That's for sure. It's nice to come to Welsh churches and hear people sing praise, I tell you what. But I mean, I won't say what I do think about the English churches, but they're more lackluster. They wouldn't be happy if they heard me talking about my church, would they? I'm reading this morning from Hebrews 4. Well, I'm going to read a little bit of chapter 4 and then a little bit into chapter 5. But from Hebrews 4, verse 14, into chapter 5, verses 10. So I'll give you a few moments to catch up with me. And then we'll head on. Everyone there? Nope, that's all right. Say amen when you're there. Say amen. Amen. That's enough for me to go. That's fine. The rest of you just have to catch up with us. Hebrews 4. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Amen. Bless that word. Back in my church in Devon, started looking at the different titles or the positions of Jesus, the titles and positions that Jesus takes on and are also given to him by others and given to him by God the Father. He has a lot of titles. There are lots of names that are given for Jesus. He's Messiah. He is, as we've just read, high priest or mediator. He is Son of God. He's Lord or teacher, the rabbi. He is God with us, Emmanuel. He is the way, the truth, the life, which, a bit of a side note, do you know what the actual relevance of that is? The truth, the life, the way, the truth, the life. Do you know what that's referring to? So in the temple, in the Jewish temple, the first gate of entrance was the way. The next gate into the inner sanctum was the truth. And then the curtain into the Holy of Holies was the life. And Jesus says, "I am now the way, the truth, the life." Just a little bit of a side note for you all. But he also calls himself and is called the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. He calls himself the Good Shepherd. He's the light of the world, and these are just some of the many, many different names and titles for Jesus, the Son of God. But this morning, we're going to focus on the great high priest. What is the great high priest. What are we actually talking about? What are we referring to? Because for us, a high priest probably doesn't mean very much. It has not got the significance and the relevance to our lives as what it did back then. So we need a little bit of a background as to what we're actually talking about here. Now, for the Jewish people of the day, this was significant. Not only was it significant, but for Jews to hear it, it was also very controversial to hear that as well. For Jesus to be the great high priest. The high priest was an extremely important, both cultural, political, and religious figure in all of Israel and all of Jewish culture completely. The title obviously is self-explanatory. High priest, he is the priest that oversees all of the other priests of the temple. He oversees all of the sacraments, all of the sacrifices that takes place. He controls, at one point, the high priest had the responsibility of controlling and managing the finances and the administration of the temple. And even at another point, during the second temple, the high priest even managed the finances and taxes of the entire nation of Israel. So he was a very important figure. He was seen as the political head of the nation. They had a king, but then they had the high priest who was appointed by God. He oversaw the daily activities of the rest of the priesthood. And he also had special functions as well. It was only the high priest that could enter into the inner sanctum. And of course, it was only the high priest that could go into the Holy of Holies and bring the sacrifice on behalf of the people of Israel on the Day of Atonement. But before he could go into the Holy of Holies, he himself had to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. So no one else could go in, otherwise they would be struck dead, as had happened before. It was an extremely important position. So this meant a lot to the Jews of the day and the early Christians. This meant a lot to them. He was a prestigious and significant position. He was the mediator between God and man, because man could not come before God. Now, his lineage of the high priest stemmed all the way back to the days of Aaron, right the way back in the Old Testament, right at the beginning. So this is a long, long-lasting position within Jewish culture. But we read here that Jesus is not just a high priest. He is the great high priest. In verses 14 to 16, we just read, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses." In other translations, it says to have compassion on our weaknesses. "But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." So these first couple of verses, just at the end of chapter 4, are just introducing the title and the statement that Jesus is the great high priest. No one would have heard of this before. This wouldn't have been a talked about thing in terms of Jesus at that time. It was controversial and confusing, especially for the Jews, because, and we'll get to that in a second, but for Jews at the time who were becoming Christian, they were struggling to get to grips, really, with the idea that they could approach God without having a priest anymore. They didn't have to go through the high priest just as they did before through the temple in order to come to the Holy of Holies, in order for God to hear them, for God to receive their sacrifice. That was really confusing for early Christians at the time. How can I come before holy God when I am not holy? How can I do that without the high priest? You're telling me I don't need to do this anymore. Well, how can I do that? So it was confusing for a lot of the early Christians. not only was it confusing for the early Christians, but it was controversial for the Jews of the day. And a big criticizing moment for the Jews and the early church at the time, a big way that they used to criticize the church, was that they could not come before the Father, so Christianity could not be superior to Judaism. You can't come before the Father because you haven't got a priesthood like we do. So you clearly can't be superior to us. We're the older religion. We're the older traditional way of doing things. This is how we come before God. You cannot. You're still on the outside. So how can you say that you are superior? How can you say that Jesus is greater than? So though there was a lot of confusion and a lot of controversy during the days of Jesus. Now the Jews had their priestly order. And they had their high priest ordained by God, like I said, stretching all the way back to Aaron in the Old Testament. But the writer, Paul here, is claiming that we do have a priest. We do have a high priest. But he's not just any high priest, but he is a greater one, greater than the high priests of old. Like I said, the earthly high priests, they would take an offering on behalf of the people on the Day of Atonement. They would bring the sacrifice into the inner sanctum where it would be offered to God on behalf of the people of Israel for their sins. But what makes Jesus even greater is that now through him, even we can enter into that Holy of Holies through him. He's greater in every way. We can enter through him and not him on our behalf anymore. So already, just in those couple of verses, we've established just how great this high priest is. He's already greater than the high priests of old. They are no longer relevant. They're no longer needed now because this great high priest has now surpassed them. Understanding why this is controversial for the Jews of the day? Understand why they did not like Christians? This was their way of life. This was their culture. This was their history. Now, despite the role being so official, so divinely appointed, Paul is showing us here that we do not have to fear approaching the Father through him anymore. He says that we can come before the throne of grace in confidence. That was a new thing. In confidence, not in shame, not in guilt, not in fear, but in confidence. We can now boldly approach the throne of God. So he is the great high priest. But how can Jesus qualify as the great high priest? How can he qualify? Well, in chapter 5, in the first couple of verses, he lays out a couple of the main qualifications that are required in order to be a high priest. I've already mentioned a couple. So my first point is that Jesus meets all of the requirements to be high priest. In chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. So these first couple of verses for chapter 5 are laying out the criteria needed in order to be called high priest. This is what you need to have attributed to your name and your life in order to become high priest. And the first one being, he needs to be man. He must be fully human in order to represent mankind. In order to truly represent the people, the high priest has to understand the people. He has to know where they're coming from. He has to understand what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, how they think, how they react. He has to be like them. So he has to be a man from them. This is why it was so important that Christ came not just fully God, but also fully man. He came to live as we live and to suffer as we suffer, to experience the world and life and all of its difficulties, all of the temptation that will come as we experience and suffer. So he can understand us and our pain and our struggle. The high priest needs to offer gifts and sacrifices on behalf of the people. Well, I don't need to delve too far into how Jesus fulfills that one already for us. He's already fulfilled the fact that he's man. He is fully man and fully God. And whilst being fully man and fully God, he also then, just to add on top and make him even greater, he then becomes the very sacrifice for us. He offers the ultimate sacrifice that not only covers temporary sins, but covers a multitude of sins for all eternity. So already, he's checked that first criteria. He is man. And then that leads into verse 2, where he says, he is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. I love that verse. I love that verse. And in other translations, it does say that he's able to be compassionate or show compassion to those who are ignorant and going astray. I mean, first of all, that's quite a challenge. I have to ask myself, am I always compassionate to those who are ignorant or those that I would deem ignorant and going astray? I know I often fail in that one personally. I'm not always as compassionate to those I would deem ignorant in the world than maybe I should. So he shows compassion to those. I prefer that version. And actually, in the original Greek and Aramaic word for compassion, it means to be shocked or appalled at something, but to hold back judgment anyway. That's what compassion is. It's not to not be appalled at what you see. It's not to say that I agree with what's going on and I think it's fine. It's to be disgusted and shocked and appalled at what's going on, but to nonetheless withhold your judgment and your wrath and your anger upon them. That's compassion. Sums up the whole reason why Christ came. It's why he came to earth. It's why he came to save us. What you will find if you're in places of leadership within churches, and this obviously happened during the days for the high priest as well, but leaders of churches and anyone in any form of leadership within church will find that God will often send trials. He will often allow difficult times to come your way for the one purpose of making sure that he reminds you of how human you are, to keep you grounded, to remind you of your weaknesses, to depend on him. And also so that when you're leading others, in whatever capacity you're leading others, you never lose your compassion for those other people. You remember, I'm just like them. I know what it is to struggle, and I know what it is to be tempted. I know what it is to suffer. It's important that the high priest could show compassion. See, on the Day of Atonement, when the people of Israel would come and bring their offering, they'd bring their lamb or they would bring their ox. This wasn't just a mundane, trivial thing that they were doing. This was a pretty harrowing experience every year. Every year, this was a pretty harrowing experience. When they bring the animal, they're laying their hand on this animal and they're confessing every single failing and weakness and sin that they have ever felt in that past year. Everything. They are laying all of that guilt, all of that shame, the things that they would not want to admit to anybody around them, even their closest relative. They wouldn't want them to hear it, and they're having to declare it before God and before this high priest. So it's important that the high priest is compassionate, because this is a painful experience for each person that's bringing his offering before God. It's also harrowing because in the way that the animal is slaughtered. So you bring your offering and you yourself have to cut that animal's throat. That's quite an experience. That's quite a harrowing moment, but intentionally. intentionally so. God needed the people to recognize this is because of you. Your sin is now causing this innocent animal to have to suffer in your place. It's a reminder, but of course Christ becomes that lamb suffering for us. So it's a painful, harrowing, difficult moment for the people on that Day of Atonement. To see an innocent animal die for their sins and to have to confess their sins before this man, he has to be able to show compassion and not judge them. Not judge them. He can't be tutting behind his breath at them when they say, oh, I've been like this year, or that's happened this year. I'm so sorry, God, I failed in this way. He can't be going, didn't think you were that kind of person. Oh, I'm glad I didn't know you earlier then. Or I'm glad I'm not like you. They can't have a high priest like that. They need a high priest who is compassionate and understands them. Is it another interesting side note? The high priest back then also used to wear a breastplate on the Day of Atonement, and the breastplate would have 12 different stones embedded into it, and on each of those stones would be carved the name of all of the different tribes of Israel, to literally resemble that the people of Israel were close to his heart. Close to his heart. And we sing in the hymn, don't we? I can't think of the name of the hymn now. We say, my name is written on your hands. My name is written on your heart. He's the great high priest, and our names are written on his heart. So he had to be a man, and he had to be a man aware of trials and temptations, a man aware of how difficult the world and life is. He needed first-hand experience. Spurgeon describes it as the approachableness of Jesus. The approachableness of Jesus. Now, how often can we individually and as churches be the opposite of that? Can we always say that we're approachable? Can we always say that we're understanding and compassionate of others? I know I struggle with this, and I struggle when I see and I hear things from other people to withhold my judgment and my opinions and not recognize they're struggling and suffering. No different to me. They just don't know the truth. They just don't have the Lamb, they don't have the Messiah living within them. It's an important question to remind ourselves and ask ourselves regularly. So Jesus is compassionate. In verse 3, this is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. In order for the high priest to bring the offering into that holy place, he first had to offer a sacrifice himself for his own sins. Because remember, this high priest was human, and he was flawed too. This goes all the way back to Leviticus 16, where God gives Aaron the command of this is how you should approach me. You shouldn't just enter as you feel and freely come and go. You must only enter into that Holy of Holies in a certain way. But obviously Jesus didn't have to cleanse himself of his own sin. But what does Jesus do for us? Jesus becomes sin for us. So he's already again fulfilling the other requirement of the high priest. That he is taking on the sins of mankind as if it was his own, becoming sin for us on our behalf, and then offering himself as the sacrifice. So Jesus is becoming all of these things in one. He's becoming the priest, he's becoming the sacrifice, and he is becoming sin itself on our behalf. He became the sacrificial lamb. He was the mediator between God and the people. God would come in judgment because of the sins of the people, and the high priest would stand in their place, offering sacrifices that satisfied God's justice and demonstrated his mercy by punishing an innocent animal in place of a guilty human being. Jesus became that sacrifice for us. So he's met the next criteria, compassion. He truly is compassion. He knows what it is to suffer and struggle. He understands us, and he understands your struggle. Whatever it is that's in your life right now, Jesus understands. He knows it. He feels it. He gets it. He gets you. Then in verse 4, and no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. Now, unlike all of the other positions within the temple, all of the other positions within the priesthood, you did not choose to become high priest. You were born into the position of high priest. So the idea, theoretically, at this time when this letter's written, the high priest should be able to trace his lineage all the way back to Aaron. He should be able to, because you are born into that line. You don't choose it. God calls you to it. It goes down from son to son. Aaron starts, goes to his eldest son, and so on and so on. But how could Christ? How could Christ meet this criteria when he himself was not a descendant of Aaron and was most definitely not from the tribe of Levi? Another requirement that was needed to be met. So this is where a lot of the confusion and the controversy came from. It was, well, how can you say that? You're now uprooting all of the traditions and the command that God gave back all the way in Leviticus. How can you possibly say he can be the high priest? And we read this in verses 5 to 6 when he says, in the same way Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, you are my son. Today I am your father. And he says in another place, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. God has appointed him. God himself called out and said, you are my son. You are priest. And in the order of Melchizedek, I'm not going to go into depth as to who Melchizedek was because that's a whole different message on its own. But he himself is a controversial character because he was a high priest that didn't meet any of those requirements in terms of being a son of Aaron and all these sorts of things, which again is just Paul pointing out, forget the former things. Forget the former things. God is doing something different now. God has a new plan. It wasn't working before. It wasn't permanent. It was temporary. God has something else prepared. So, Jesus, as we've just seen, has met all of the criteria in order to be high priest. So that's my first point, believe it or not. Second point is suffering. Suffering. In verse 7 to 10, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son, though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So we've already read and covered the fact that the high priest is expected to be compassionate. He needs to be able to empathize with the people. And we know Jesus has already met that requirement. And Paul is just pointing out here when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's facing his death. A pretty difficult moment for anyone. Anyone that's ever going to have to know that their death is coming, and they know it's going to be a pretty horrific, painful death. They know the mocking and the slander they're going to have to experience. The humiliation they're going to have to go through. The treatment of even his own that he will have to experience. He knows what's coming. And we're being reminded here that he has this in mind in the Garden of Gethsemane. And being fully human, he doesn't just go, that's fine, I don't mind, it's going to be great, I know it's got to happen. He hasn't got that attitude. Remember, Jesus is both fully God and fully man. And he offers up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. Seeing the human side of Jesus, the reality of Jesus, the approachableness of Jesus. Now, obviously, him also being fully God means he doesn't just leave it there. He very quickly follows it up with, but not my will, yours, Lord. Your will be done. But that doesn't mean he didn't feel the struggle. Doesn't mean he didn't feel the fear, the knowledge of what was to come. The responsibility, remember, was to offer a sacrifice on behalf of the people collectively. He took the offering to God on behalf of the people. So he has to do it without judgment and without ridicule. Not separating himself from the people and saying, I'm not like them. I don't quite feel or react to things in the way they do. I don't suffer and struggle in the way they do. So I'm just bringing you forward, on their behalf, but this isn't from me, God. I don't feel like that. Jesus wasn't like that. Jesus wasn't like that. And we see that in the garden. He struggled with temptation and hardship just as we do. And when he cried out in the garden, he was sweating profusely in the coolness of night. In the coolness of night. That just again shows you just how anxious he was about what was to come. He was sweating profusely, knowing what was to come. Take the cup from me, Lord, if you can. If you can. If there's any other way, God, please. Your will be done. He knows what it is to struggle. He knows what it is to fear. And then verse 8 says, an interesting passage, a really interesting passage. Son, though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. A really interesting and, in my opinion, difficult passage. I struggle with that passage, and I've often overlooked it and its significance, probably because I didn't like what that passage was saying, in all honesty, so I thought I'd just ignore that I even said that, really. But it's an intriguing verse. He learned obedience from what he suffered. See, perhaps there are things that are going on in your life right now. Maybe there are trials and sufferings and difficulties going on in your life right now that you are only seeing the bad side of. That you are only looking at from one perspective, seeing completely negatively, and not seeing the opportunity to learn. Not seeing the opportunity to lean more on God. To go deeper into relationship with him. To rely on him that little bit more. Now, I'm not saying everything that you might go through comes from God. Of course not. Often a lot of our problems we bring on ourselves because of our own foolishness and our own pride. And sometimes things happen. We live in a fallen world, a sinful world, and unfortunately, bad things do just sometimes happen. There's not always a higher meaning to things. But perhaps there may be something going on in your life or something around the corner that happens that maybe is a chance to learn some obedience. Lean in on God. Going further and deeper into relationship with him. God might have something in store for you. Trust in God and hear his word in the midst of your trials, in the midst of your difficulties, and in the midst of your temptations, because he understands. Whether it's from God, whether it's of your own making, whether it's from the world, remember, he is the great high priest who understands your heart. That should be encouraging. That should be comforting. That should bring us peace and stillness in the knowledge that we have a high priest who understands me. He gets my struggle. He doesn't judge me. He can empathize with me 100%. And therefore, I can trust in him. I can rely on him no matter what. So the main conclusion, really. I don't know what's going on in people's lives here this morning. I don't know. I don't know whether it's family, whether it's work, whether it's personal. I don't know. And no one else needs to know. That is between you and your high priest. That is between you and him. We don't have to know. But there's one thing that you should know and take away from this morning and take comfort from. That he gets it. He gets it. He gets you in the midst of your struggle, in the midst of your trial. Whatever it is that's going on. It might seem huge to you right now. It might seem like it's worth despairing and throwing the towel in over. You might not understand or be able to see the light at the end of that tunnel and see how God can possibly use this for any good. It might seem senseless to you. It might seem unfair and unjust to you right now. And perhaps it is. But take comfort that you have a great high priest who is interceding on your behalf before God. And all you have to do is call out to him. Call upon his name, lean on him, and he will deliver you. He will deliver you. He cannot fail. He will not fail. Not only is Jesus the means by which we can now approach God so boldly and confidently, but Jesus is also the source of our strength and our confidence here on earth. How amazing is that? So Jesus is not just a high priest. He is the great high priest, greater than all high priests before, greater than anything in this world, anything that we hold to in this world, that we try to put our trust and all of our faith and all of our effort in to save us. Don't bother, because you have a great high priest who is greater than anything in this world that you could possibly trust in. He gets you, and he gets your struggle where you are. Amen.